who, if nobody knows, actually has been harassed by the Secret Service because he's a nasty terrorist.
Today, my lovely wife, my children, we'd like to thank you for coming here today. It's an honor to host this tea party. It's a privilege to have you here. God bless you and thanks for coming. There is an old saying, I'm sure you've heard it, that the politician, the attorney, do not give us our freedoms. There's but one person that does, and that's the soldier, that's the veteran. I'd like to tell you a quick story about a man. He's an old soldier now, but his life typifies what it is to be an American. He was not afraid to fight. He had courage, valor, and he had compassion. His name is Andy, and the story begins in 1919 in a Pennsylvania mining town. He was the son of a coal miner. When he was 10 years old, Andy's dad got all the money he had together and bought a farm with bottomland in Cooperstown, New York, looking for a better life. When the war started, Andy and his brothers thought, if the Japanese and Germans want to fight, by God, we'll give them one. So all 5 brothers joined up and went to serve their country. Andy, the farm boy from Cooperstown, advanced quickly. Being a farm boy, he knew how to shoot, he could drive equipment, he was a mechanic, and being one of 5 brothers, he knew how to fight. Andy was a young officer in charge of a small tank company and infantry battalion. He landed in Normandy, Omaha Beach, 2 days after the initial invasion. His orders were to move inland, and he did. He took his company into the hedgerows of France and right smack into the middle of a German army. Now, Andy and his boys were green. They'd never been in battle before, but they were now. The battle went for 2 days. The fighting deviated into hand-to-hand. The lines were so intertwined you couldn't tell where the American lines ended and the German lines began. Andy made the comment that men fought with whatever they had. If they had one arm, they fought with it. There was no retreat, there was no surrender, there were no prisoners. It was a fight to the death. Sadly, Andy was losing. His boys were green, they'd never been in battle. The German army was hardened. They were ready for a fight. In desperation, Andy was about to be overwhelmed, about to be annihilated. His company was lost. He called it an airstrike. When the medium, on his own position, and when the medium bombers landed and dropped their payloads, the bombs were so close, Andy's eardrums were ruptured. But it turned the tide of the battle. Andy and his boys became men that day. The Germans retreated, and they won the day. Andy and his men moved into the hill country of France. They came across a French village that was heavily fortified. The Germans were going to retreat no longer. Andy was 25 years old. He was the old man of the group. He was ordered to send in his infantry to rout the Germans. The village was 600 years old. It was historic, and the French did not want it destroyed. Now this young man was bearing the burden of leadership. He looked at his men, many of them boys, some of them shaving but twice a week. He wondered how many would have to die. He thought of their mothers, their fathers, their sweethearts at home. He wondered how many mothers would never see their sons again. And he turned to his men and he said, and I can't repeat what Andy said because there's ladies present, but to paraphrase, Andy said, to hell with it, send in the tanks. The young officer from Cooperstown ordered his tanks into battle. They loaded their 75mm guns, put their machine guns on fully automatic, and pushed everything before them. They routed the Germans, and I have been privileged to see a picture of Andy, a smiling young officer, Thompson carbine in his hand, a German helmet at his feet, leaning against a pole. And that pole was the only thing left standing in that 600-year-old historic French village. Now, Andy got in a little trouble for this because he disobeyed orders. But the saying was back then, he got reprimanded and he got winked at. His U.S. Army does not punish a man for winning the day and saving his men's lives. Andy and his men fought on. They crossed the Rhine and pushed deeper into Germany. Soon they came across a German town. This was the last 2 weeks of the war. The fighting was at its fiercest. The Germans were determined to protect the town because underneath it was an active factory. As Andy and his men moved closer, they saw the German army moving artillery up on the hill. Knowing they had to be stopped, if put in place as tanks would be easy pickings, Andy and his boys jumped in the fastest vehicles they had, which were Jeeps, and headed to the fight. As he approached the hillside, Andy's Jeep was hit by a Panzerfaust, which is a German rocket-propelled grenade launcher used to take out tanks. His Jeep was obliterated, his driver was killed, and Andy lay unconscious, bleeding American blood on German soil. When he awoke, he was a German prisoner of war. He was dragged to a German field hospital, which was nothing more than a chicken coop. And as he lay there bleeding, he saw German soldiers, the same men who hours before he was trying to kill and who were trying to kill him, laying there screaming, suffering, limbs gone. In an act of compassion, Andy realized that these were probably farm boys, the same as he. They were simply the Wehrmacht, the German soldier, the German GI, if you will, doing what their country told them to do. At another time, in another place, they might have been friends. In an act of compassion, he offered the German officer his morphine, told him to treat his wounded, ease their suffering. He would be okay without it. The German doctor didn't know what to do, but he happily accepted the medicine and eased the suffering as best he could. As the hours passed, Andy could hear the tanks coming. His boys were coming to save him. The Germans, realizing the end was near, dismantled the hospital, prepared to retreat. At that instant, an SS officer walked into the hospital, put a 9mm Luger to Andy's head and said in perfect English, "I am going to kill you." I don't know what Andy was thinking, but I bet he was thinking of his mom and his dad and his brothers. And that farm in Cooperstown was 1,000,000 miles away. Luckily, the German medic stepped forward, told the officer to holster his weapon and let that man live. And he did. He survived the war, he mended, he came home to Cooperstown and started farming. He met the love of his life, a pretty young gal from Cooperstown named Joan. They had 50 years together. Sadly, Joan passed away a little while ago, but Andy had 2 fine sons and a great daughter. Now he has 6 grandchildren to keep Grandpa busy. Now Andy was going to be here today, but Andy's 90 years old. And time has done something to Andy the German army couldn't do. It slowed him down. So I'd like to ask a favor of you. When you drive up from Milford, Cherry Valley, on the main road, I believe it's Route 166. Halfway up, there's a turn to Middlefield. Opposite that right-hand turn is a nice-looking farm with good bottomland. That's where Andy and his boys are farming it. When you drive by, I'd appreciate it if you'd say a prayer. Prayer for Andy and for Joan, and at the same time say a prayer to Almighty God that such men as Andy have lived. Thank you very much. God bless you.